On October 14, 2025, Microsoft did something it had done many times before with older versions of Windows. It ended support for Windows 10. No more security updates, no more patches, no more protection against the vulnerabilities that get discovered every single month in software that hundreds of millions of people rely on to protect their data, their work, and their financial lives. Microsoft's expectation, based on how this had always worked in the past, was straightforward. People would upgrade to Windows 11 on existing hardware if it qualified. People whose hardware did not qualify would buy new machines. A small number of people would pay for extended security update subscriptions to keep Windows 10 running safely for one more year. And the cycle that has driven Microsoft's consumer operating system business for 4 decades would continue exactly as it always had. What Microsoft did not expect was what actually happened. Millions of people looked at Windows 11's hardware requirements, looked at the price of new computers, looked at what Windows 11 actually was, the ads in the start menu, the mandatory Microsoft account, the Copilot integration that could not be fully disabled, the recall feature taking screenshots of everything on their screens, and they made a different choice. They chose an operating system that Microsoft has been dismissing, mocking, and treating as irrelevant to mainstream consumers for 30 years. They chose Linux, and the numbers behind that choice represent something that has not happened before in the history of personal computing. Something that, once started, does not reverse itself. And something that Microsoft, for all its resources and market power, is structurally incapable of stopping. Let me show you exactly what the data looks like, because the scale of what happened needs to be understood before anything else in this story makes sense. In July 2022, Linux had a 2.76% share of the global desktop market. That number had been stuck in roughly that range for years. Decades, really. Linux on the desktop was the perpetual joke of the technology industry. Every year, someone would declare it the year of the Linux desktop. Every year, nothing meaningfully changed. The developers loved it. The servers ran on it. The world's supercomputers ran exclusively on it, but the average person sitting at a home computer used Windows, and that had been the reality since the early 1990s and showed no signs of changing. Then Windows 10 hit its end-of-life date, and by the end of 2025, Linux desktop market share had climbed to 4.7% globally. That is a 70% increase in 3 years. The United States crossed 5% for the first time in its history in June 2025. India, which has been building Linux adoption through government programs and educational initiatives for years, reached 16%. Steam, the world's largest PC gaming platform, recorded Linux users at 5.33% in March 2026, the highest level ever recorded since Steam launched Linux support over a decade ago. Zorin OS alone, a single Linux distribution designed specifically for Windows refugees, reported over 780,000 Windows users transitioning to Linux in the wake of the Windows 10 end-of-life announcement. Not 780,000 total downloads. 780,000 people specifically coming from Windows. These numbers are not a revolution. I want to be honest about that because this video is only useful if it tells you the truth rather than the most dramatic version of events. Windows still holds 66% of the global desktop market. Microsoft is not going bankrupt. The enterprise relationships that generate the majority of Microsoft's revenue are not in immediate danger, but something has changed that has not changed before. And the reason it cannot be stopped is not about Linux being better than Windows in every way for every user. It is about the structural conditions that produced this shift and why those conditions are not going to reverse themselves no matter what Microsoft does next. The first shift is the hardware wall. When Microsoft announced that Windows 11 would require a TPM20 security chip, a requirement that effectively excluded machines manufactured before approximately 2017, it created a population of people with working, capable computers who had no supported upgrade path to Microsoft's current operating system. Estimates of the size of that stranded population ranged from 240 million to 400 million devices worldwide. These are not broken machines. They are not slow machines. Many of them are perfectly capable of running modern software and doing everything their owners need them to do. Microsoft's message to those owners was to buy new hardware. Linux's message was different. Linux Mint, Ubuntu, Zorin OS, and dozens of other distributions run beautifully on hardware that Microsoft has declared obsolete. A laptop from 2015 that Microsoft will no longer support runs Linux Mint with better performance than it ran Windows 10, because Linux requires significantly less system overhead to operate, and because Linux distributions do not accumulate the background processes, telemetry services, and update infrastructure that Windows installs alongside itself. The people who received Microsoft's message and chose not to buy new hardware did not disappear from computing. They migrated, and the hardware they migrated on is hardware they already owned, which means the financial case for switching was not just neutral, it was actively positive. They spent nothing and got a faster, more secure operating system on a machine Microsoft had told them was finished. The second shift is gaming, and this one deserves special attention because gaming was the one wall that kept Linux permanently in the margins for most of its existence. If you are a gamer, and your games do not run on an operating system, you do not use that operating system. It is that simple. And for most of Linux's history, Windows gaming was the only serious gaming platform. The titles you wanted to play ran on Windows. The anti-cheat systems game developers used were Windows-specific. The graphics driver optimization that made games run at their best was Windows-focused. Linux gaming was a hobby for enthusiasts willing to spend hours troubleshooting compatibility problems, not a viable platform for people who wanted to play games without friction. Valve changed this. Not overnight, and not without a commercial motivation that had nothing to do with Linux advocacy. Valve built the Steam Deck, a handheld gaming PC that runs SteamOS, a Linux-based operating system. To make the Steam Deck viable as a gaming device, Valve needed its library of Windows games to run on Linux. So Valve built and funded the development of Proton, a compatibility layer that translates Windows game code into instructions that Linux can execute. The result is that as of 2026, Proton makes approximately 106,000 of Steam's 117,000 games playable on Linux. Not all of them perfectly, not all of them at the highest performance levels, but the vast majority of Steam's library now runs on Linux well enough to be genuinely playable. And for many titles, the performance difference compared to Windows is negligible or non-existent. The Steam Deck introduced millions of people to Linux gaming without ever telling them they were using Linux. They bought a handheld gaming device. It ran their games, and the operating system underneath was something they never had to think about. That familiarity removed a psychological barrier that decades of Linux advocacy had failed to remove. When those Steam Deck users started asking whether they could put the same software environment on their desktop PC, the answer was yes. The third shift is the one that matters most for the long-term trajectory of this story, and it is happening in places that receive almost no coverage in the technology press because it is not exciting to write about. Government, IT procurement decisions. Governments around the world are migrating away from Microsoft and toward Linux at a scale and pace that has no historical precedent in the operating system market. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein became the first jurisdiction in Europe to completely replace Microsoft's tools with Linux and LibreOffice in public offices. 30,000 government computers migrating from Windows to Linux is not a pilot program or an experiment. It is a completed institutional decision. France operates over 103,000 computers running Ubuntu, a custom Ubuntu-based Linux distribution used by the National Gendarmerie. Denmark's Ministry of Digital Affairs announced a transition from Microsoft to open-source platforms. With half the ministry's staff migrated by August 2025, Switzerland has begun exploring open-source requirements for public digital infrastructure. And these are not isolated national decisions driven by unusual circumstances. They are coordinated responses to a concern that European governments have been discussing at the policy level for years. Digital sovereignty. When your government's operations run on software controlled by a foreign corporation, you have outsourced a degree of national control over your own digital infrastructure. Linux, as an open-source operating system where the code is publicly auditable and no single corporation controls the upgrade path, represents an alternative where governments and institutions own their own technology stack rather than renting it.